Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to wait for a little bit for everyone to log in. Welcome to our event with Peter Staley, Greenlight bookstore, and interviewer Ann Northrop. If you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, that's always fun to see before we get started. Hello, hello. Okay, I'm going to get started. We have a lot of people here. And good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Ben from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Peter Staley launching his new book, Never Silent, Act Up and My Life in Activism. He'll be talking with Ann Northrop, so you are in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thank you to Peter, Ann, and the team at Chicago Review Press for making this happen, to all of you for showing up. Although we're still not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here, and we're grateful for your support and the chance to make space for these conversations and connections. Just a couple of housekeeping things that I'll go through quickly. We're in a Zoom webinar tonight. You can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you, but they can see that you're here and what you say in the chat. And there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. And you're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat throughout. That's a great way to show appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons, and we'll be pulling questions only from that Q&A module to be answered in the later part of the program for our audience Q&A. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Never Silent, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 to 7 at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, or you can purchase Peter's book and many others on our website at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. And I'll drop that buy link in the chat again later. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of indie bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. We appreciate it. Now to introduce our guests. Our interviewer tonight is Ann Northrop, a veteran journalist and activist. She was a longtime member of ACT UP, where she was arrested many times for civil disobedience, most famously inside St. Patrick's Cathedral in the Stop the Church action. Northrop currently co-hosts the Gay USA weekly TV news program. She will be speaking with our featured author, Peter Staley. Peter Staley is one of the leading AIDS and LGBTQ rights activists of his generation, playing a critical role in some of ACT UP's best known actions, and then co-founding TAG and PrEP for All. Today, Staley speaks to audiences worldwide on grassroots activism and is the lead plaintiff against multiple pharmaceutical companies for anti-competitive practices in Staley v. Gilead. Peter's new book, Never Silent, is the inside story of what brought Staley to ACT UP and the explosive and sometimes painful years to follow. Years filled with triumph, humiliation, joy, loss, and persistence. Staley, a shrewd strategist with nerves of steel, organized some of the group's most spectacular actions, from shutting down trading on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to putting a giant condom over the house of Senator Jesse Helms. Never Silent is guaranteed to inspire the activists within all of us. And Peter's going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Ann and with all of you. So I now welcome Peter to take it away.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Ann. We're back together again. People forget that we played a married couple before we walked into St. Patrick's Cathedral and got arrested together. So I'm going to do a reading first before Ann and I talk, and jumping into the kind of the middle of the book with an action. The first action we did against Burroughs Wellcome in April 1989. And a few months before that, Mark Harrington and I had been down to their headquarters in Research Triangle Park, talking to their senior executives about the price of AZT. Just talking with them didn't convince them to lower the price, but I was scoping out the security situation while I was there. And 3 months after that, a bunch of us drove down in a van and checked into a hotel and planned to do an action at Burroughs Wellcome's headquarters. And you'll hear a lot of first names, but I did introduce people in the book as to the team that was comprised of this action. The alarm clock buzzed loudly at 7 a.m. With Jay and Steve staying at the hotel to run a hopefully busy media center later that morning, the six of us heading to Research Triangle Park needed to look the part. As we had on earlier actions, we donned our best corporate drag, coats and ties for the guys, a nice blouse and skirt for Deborah. Evidence of our queer city roots were removed, including multiple earrings on Blaine and a single diamond stud from my right earlobe. Deborah actually had to add earrings. I briefed Dan on my new plan, and he was game. After a high-protein breakfast, the six of us hit the road in our 2 rented vehicles for the short drive to Research Triangle Park. We parked the van in a lot across the street from the headquarters at 9:45 a.m. and did final checks of our cell phones and walkie-talkies. Dan and the 4 infiltrators piled into the Ford sedan and drove to our target. At 9:55 a.m., Dan confidently walked into the lobby of Burroughs Wellcome. He asked the guards behind the reception desks for directions to the BW Fund, which we already knew was across the street. They pointed the way for him and described the short drive. "Thanks, guys. We've been on the road a while. Is there a bathroom I can use?" Dan asked in his Dan Rather voice, the perfect spokesman voice for interviews, making ACT UP sound calm, determined, and reasonable. 5 minutes later, Dan was back in the car with a full description of his just completed test run of our infiltration plan. First, the bad news. There were 3 guards behind the reception desk, not the single guard that had been there during my visit in January. Then, some good news. The lobby's bathroom was just around the corner from the elevator, which was about 20 feet from the reception desk. At 10:15 a.m., all 5 of us entered the lobby, briefcases in hand. Dan led and played it casual and cool. "Hey guys, we're back," he told the guards with a chuckle. "The folks at the BW Fund couldn't find the person we have a meeting scheduled with in their directory and suggested we try here." "What employee's name?" one of the guards asked. "Peter McGrath," Dan replied, using a mashup of James and my names. "Excuse me," I interrupted. "Can the rest of us use the bathroom while you try to find this guy?" "Sure," the guard said, pointing. "It's just around the corner." As Dan stayed behind, we walked toward the bathrooms. Luck was with us. A female employee was entering the elevator as we approached, and we slipped in behind her. "Hey, that's the wrong way," a guard yelled out. Our hearts were pounding. The female employee, hearing the guard, began to reach across me for the door open button. "It's okay," I told her as I put my hand gently on her arm while the elevator door started to close. We heard the guard's hard leather-soled shoes hitting the lobby's marble floor in a sprint. Thankfully, they were too late. In the confusion now below us, Dan quietly walked out of the lobby to the safety of our car. Our elevator guest, with her slightly concerned expression, got off on the 2nd floor. We exited on the 3rd floor and made our way to a row of offices facing the nearby highway, where TV trucks could get a good look at us. Along the way, I snapped open my briefcase and pulled out the cell phone and walkie-talkie, handing the latter to Lee. I pointed to the first office with a good highway view, holding the cell phone to my ear. A woman was sitting at the only desk in the small 10-foot by 10-foot space, talking on her phone. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lee said with authority, pointing with his walkie-talkie with the demeanor of a security guard. "There's a situation on this floor. Please walk calmly to the lobby until further notice." "Joyce, I gotta go," she said into the phone, then quickly hung up and walked out. As soon as she rounded the corner, the 4 of us squeezed into her office and shut the door. I immediately called Jay and Steve at the hotel. "We're in," I said. "Do your magic." Using 2 phones, a fax machine, and a well-researched contact list of local and national media, they started alerting TV stations and newspapers, faxing out our pre-written press release. At 10 a.m. this morning, 4 AIDS activists seized an office at the headquarters of Burroughs Wellcome Company, demanding that Burroughs lower the retail price of antiretroviral drug Retrovir, or AZT, by at least 25% from the current level of $8,000 a year. After explaining the issues involved, it went on to say, the activists, who include both people with AIDS and people with AIDS-related complex, say they plan to stay inside the premises until Burroughs agrees to their demands or until they are evicted. The sit-in is the first time that a group of people dependent on a drug have taken action against a manufacturer's headquarters site. They have set aside $5,000 to reimburse the company for any property damage incurred during the action. Before I had even ended the call with our media team, that property damage had begun. James wielded his battery-operated drill like a surgeon, while Blaine played nurse, quickly handing him a steady flow of steel mending plates and screws. In less than a minute, James had secured all 3 edges of the metal door to its frame using more than a dozen plates. Even a battering ram couldn't open it now. But we had a problem. The dinky office had a second door on the wall to the right of the exterior windows. Worse still, this one opened outward. Luckily, James had packed for multiple contingencies and grabbed a bunch of steel corner braces from his briefcase. Feed me these, he told Blaine as they moved their operation to the second door, which was soon sealed. The cell phone rang. There was a reporter with the Associated Press. Our media team was feeding us press interviews, one at a time, each limited to 5 minutes, with James' busy drill providing a dramatic soundtrack to the curious reporters. We also had another problem. Both doors had rectangular plexiglass transom windows above them, which could be broken through pretty easily. We improvised. Blaine emptied a small metal bookcase behind the desk and with Lee's help, ripped it apart. 2 of its disassembled panels fit perfectly over the windows, and James's drill drilled them into place. We were entombed. An AP wire story about our invasion had already gone out, and a few national radio stations began running it. Someone started pounding on the office door, asking who we were and why we were there. We're from ACT UP, I yelled back. We're demanding that Burroughs Wellcome lower the price of AZT. We are non-violent and unarmed. But we won't be coming out until the company responds to our demands. Silence. We returned to work. While others continued doing cell phone interviews, I unpacked the suction cups and glass cutter, placing the cups on the huge slanted wall of glass facing the highway. The plan was to hang our banner outside the window for a dramatic photo of the action. I tried cutting out a large square piece, but the cutter did nothing more than scratch the surface. The windows were almost an inch thick. I tried using James's drill, but none of the bits could penetrate the glass. By this time, I had worked up a sweat. Let's try the chair, I said. Stand in the far corner of the room and face away from the glass. I closed my eyes and heaved the heavy leather chair against the glass. The smack was loud and scary, but did nothing to the glass. I tried again, nothing. Even Studley James tried a couple of times, and still nothing. By this point, the chair wasn't doing so well, with its casters flying off and the armrests bent in. I radioed Dan and Deborah on their walkie-talkie and told them we'd have to use Plan B for the arriving press. We wouldn't be hanging a banner, and the tinted glass prevented cameras from getting a good view of us. The TV crews and newspaper photographers were told to congregate near the front entrance of the building. Then came another knock on the door. This is the Durham police. You are trespassing on these premises. Open this door or we'll have to enter forcibly. You have 10 minutes to decide. Drama queen, Blaine muttered. We waited in silence. 10 minutes later, the door rocked from a hard thud. They were trying to body slam it open. James's handiwork was holding strong. They slammed harder. They slammed harder with no luck. We heard someone say, "Let me try," as the thuds continued. We all smiled and gave the thumbs up sign to James. Several minutes passed. We heard a muffled conversation down the hall. We couldn't make it out. And then, boom, The room shook. The dust fell from the ceiling. They were body slamming the damn wall instead of the door. Unlike older, hardened office walls, there were apparently nothing between us and the police except 2 layers of sheetrock and some steel studwork. With another blow, the room shook again as the entire wall warped inward. A couple ceiling tiles crashed to the floor, as did our hopes of holding our space much longer. The air in the office became cloudy with dust. Handcuffs, I said. The others grabbed their handcuffs while pulling out the long chain and padlock. I wrapped the chain around a radiator cover and locked it into a loop. Then we handcuffed ourselves to the chain. I radioed the last message to Dan and Deborah. The jig is up. They're breaking through the wall. Tell the press we'll be out soon. Amazingly, though, the wall stood. The cops decided to kick a hole through it, then widen it. After 3 or 4 kicks, we saw a boot burst through the wall about 2 feet above the door. The boot kept kicking until the hole was about 2 feet wide. A cop on all 4s peeked through, spotting us across the room. He crawled through, immediately followed by another cop, and then another. The 3 of them rushed towards us, sweating and angry. We won't resist, I said. It's okay, we won't resist. As they assessed the situation, they soon calmed down. What's this? One of them asked, grabbing the chain. A chain, I replied. The cops started ripping apart the radiator cover to release the chain. One of them used James's drill to remove all the mending plates from the door. Guess we don't have to handcuff you, a cop laughed. Let's just lead them out with the chain. Ooh, I thought to myself, that'll make for a great picture. They grabbed our briefcases and unused banner and led us back to the elevator, then down to the lobby. Dozens of employees had gathered there, standing back, silent, but with all eyes observing us as we passed. We had been inside for just 55 minutes. I was pissed off they got us out that quickly, but it didn't matter. We had given the press plenty of time to gather outside. They swarmed us as we approached the parking lot. One of the TV reporters yelled a question, asking us why we had sealed ourselves inside the headquarters. Borough's welcome is profiting off our lives, I said. That's why we did today what we did. And if they don't start listening to my community, to our community, the AIDS community, then we're going to be back. A photographer with the Raleigh News and Observer, the leading local paper, snapped the perfect picture. 2 sheriff's deputies from Durham leading us to their car. One is wearing a classic 4-dent flat-brimmed sheriff's hat with a large shield on the front. Blaine is in the foreground, mid-stride, taking a confident step forward. James and I have our suit coats off, slung carefully over our shoulders, as if strolling on a lunch break on a warm sunny summer day. The deputy in front is leading us all by a long, looped chain. Perfectly framed, the headquarters of Borough's Welcome towers behind us. The picture filled almost a quarter of the Raleigh News and Observer's front page the next morning. Another newspaper dubbed us the Chain Gang. During the drive to the Durham police station, the 4 of us were crammed in the back of a sheriff's cruiser. One of the deputies asked us to explain the issue we were protesting about. Have you heard of AZT? I asked. I think so, one of them replied. That's that AIDS drug, right? Yep, I said. We're trying to get them to lower the price. They originally priced it at $10,000 a year, the most expensive drug in history. $10,000, the deputy asked incredulously. That's crazy. That was our first sign we might get some very sympathetic press that day. But not everyone would be so friendly. In Durham County, a magistrate sets release conditions and bail after your arrest. Our lawyer had warned us that the magistrate on duty that day had a reputation for being very tough. She would likely look unkindly on radical young activists from New York City flagrantly breaking laws in her tough-on-crime Southern County. It probably didn't help that all 3 local TV stations were parked outside, each running live reports on their noon broadcasts. We were the lead story on all 3. After they booked and fingerprinted us, we sat in a holding cell for almost 2 hours while charges were being decided. The police continued their kindness, only charging us with 2 misdemeanors, first-degree trespass and willful damage to property. The maximum sentence we faced was 2.5 years in jail, versus the 10 that we estimated by our lawyer. With the TV crews still waiting outside, we were brought before the magistrate. She was behind a high counter in a small room with no chairs, not far from the holding cells. "Gentlemen," she began, "I'm sure you were looking forward to some television interviews before getting home to New York. But these are still serious charges. I'm setting your bail at $5,000 each." "So 20,000 total?" I asked. "That's right," she said smugly. "Do you take traveler's checks?" I asked, breaking a smile, knowing full well they were acceptable. I reached into my inside coat pocket and whipped out a thick stack of $100 American Express traveler's checks. Her eyes widened. "Do you have a pen?" I asked. I had brought exactly $20,000, having withdrawn the amount from my brokerage account before the trip. Our lawyer nailed it. He predicted we might need that much if the magistrate got tough on us. Outside, the press swarmed us, and we answered all their questions. And Ann Northrop.
Sorry, I had to unmute. That was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And
Yay.
and
Sorry, I went a little long.
I wouldn't have missed a minute of it.
Okay,
And I think it was a perfect illustration of how much fun we had at ACT UP. And people don't understand. Of course, this was all serious business. Of course, these were serious issues. But man, did we have a good time with creative actions like that. So thank you for reading that passage. I'm sure people loved it. And people are tuning in from all over the country. So hello to all of you who are out there, everywhere from New York City to LA to the Adirondacks to a prison in California, Charlottesville, Virginia. We're thrilled to have all of you here. Peter, I'm always interested in how people got into this in the first place. And you really take your time at the beginning of the book to tell your story. You did not start out as an activist like this, and you didn't even grow up in a, lefty family. You're a suburban Pennsylvania guy who played the classical piano and went to Wall Street. So how do you see this evolution?
Well, first off, we were definitely not like some of the really lefty traditional progressive families that a lot of ACT UPers came from. But we were a very political family, and thankfully politically divided. My mother was a diehard Democrat, and my dad was kind of a Rockefeller Republican. And he was a businessman. He was a CEO of a chemical company. And so we would have these roaring political arguments at the dinner table. And I finally caught the political bug when Carter was president and dreamed of getting into politics someday. And Wall Street was really my stepping stone in my head to a future political career. I know that sounds crazy now.
Not with all the Goldman Sachs people who went to work in government, for God's sake.
You can't do that as a stepping stone anymore. But back then, that was considered completely reasonable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I in my head, I was like, I'm going to do my 20s on Wall Street, make my nest egg, self-finance my run for Congress in my 30s, maybe become a senator in my 40s, and who knows what happens after that, right? Dream big. So that, and I was on the path. I graduated Oberlin with economics and degree. I got a job right away at JP Morgan. I became a US government bond trader, one of the craziest, wildest, high-paying jobs on Wall Street, and which I instantly started hating. But then the whole story changed by my diagnosis in '85. And I'm pretty sure I got infected, and looking back now, in the summer of '83, my first summer in New York while I was in the training program at the bank.
And just to be clear, we're talking about HIV for people who've been on another planet somewhere.
Yes. And I found out right after Rock Hudson had died, and there were no drugs. It was horribly scary. It really caught me off guard. I was so closeted and so clueless about all things gay. And all I knew were the bars. And I was 24 and very, very scared. I came out to my family and had a really frightening year and a half trying to get myself on a learning curve and everything of what was going on and what chances I had. And then good luck for me, ACT UP was born. I got handed a flyer on my way to work to the bond trading floor of ACT UP's first demo, and got to the very next meeting. And so I've always said I came to ACT UP for very selfish reasons. I was desperate to see if I could add some months or years to my life. I was pretty convinced I wouldn't live much past 3-4 years. But I really wanted to see if I could add to that time. And I just, within months, by that summer, really, that selfishness kind of faded away. I caught this bug of this progressive empathy, and we're here to change not just what happens in this room to us. We're here to change the world. And
Well,
it
and
was a
I think,
beautiful thing. So,
yes, very beautiful. And I saw the same thing, not as someone with HIV, but just as someone who cared about these issues and found that beauty and magic in the room. But I've often said that, people talk about ACT UP being predominantly gay white men. I think it's important to know that, in fact, it was quite a collection of different people from different experiences. But what I have said is that ACT UP was gay white men who thought they were privileged and fine. And when they became HIV infected, they were shocked to find out that, in fact, people in power didn't care about them and that they were not so privileged, but they were privileged enough to get angry about it. And that is where ACT UP was born. So I'm curious about your experience. You go from Wall Street to ACT UP. What was your experience of walking into that room with not a room full of Wall Street traders? Did these people look alien to you? Did you feel at home? How did that happen?
Well, first, going back to your comment, I totally agree with you. I kind of quipped to myself that the number one emotion that drove ACT UP was not anger, which was in our name, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, but I mean, United in Anger was our byline, and United in Indignation. because
How dare you?
Because it was, yeah, how dare you? How dare you ignore us? How dare you let us die?
Yeah.
White men. And so yeah, that had a huge influence in the movement. It was a huge organizing influence. But luckily for the modern queer rights movement, that posture of indignation has never subsided. It trickled out throughout the entire movement, and now we just won't stand for anything less. And I think it's kind of a great posture to take. So when it wasn't totally foreign to me, and I'll tell you why. Because I went to Oberlin, and I did a junior year abroad at the London School of Economics, which made Oberlin look moderate. So I encountered two very progressive and in the latter case with LSE, almost radical student bodies, where I was definitely and I considered myself a, a, a liberal, a Democrat, but I was to the right of most, because I was still, I was not a socialist, and a lot of people at Oberlin were, and everyone, it seemed, at LSE was. And I spent years in glorious marijuana tinged debates, having political fights with my friends at both schools, and coming to understand them absolutely fully, and cutting my teeth politically with them. So, and as crazy as the ACT UP meetings were, they paled in comparison to the London School of Economics Student Congress that would happen in the big hall with a balcony where people would be spitball. Instead of the left and right like we had at ACT UP, or one camp was on the left side of the room and the other on the right side. Years later, they had the radicals in the balcony, and the more active members in the orchestra, and the radicals would constantly spitball the people on the stage. I'm getting off track, but I had I had cut my teeth at school. So the whole, chaotic process, and Robert's Rules of Order, and lots of emotions, and lots of strong opinions, I had seen before. And but I, like many, I waited for a couple months and stood in the back and learned, because it was intimidating. And you and a few others like Michael Nesline, and Larry Kramer, and Maxine, and especially the lesbians who had prior movement experience, they were like right away throwing their hands up and speaking and really dominating conversations, and really steering the movement and which target it was going to do, and our structures. And I was fascinated by the dynamic in the room, and was just trying to absorb all of that in the first few months before I dared raise my hand the first time, probably in the fall, or late that summer.
That's all true. And I was impressed by the range of people in the room. There was one guy who got up one night and said he'd been the national secretary of SDS. And
Yeah.
I thought, whoa, cool. But people would ask me why I was attracted to a group that was primarily men. And I would say it was the one place I could go where men were looking for training and guidance from the women. And I thought that was a beautiful kind of dynamic. And we all learned from each other, and we were all there for our different agendas. But to me, the beauty of it was that all of that was important, and we accepted the fact that everybody had their own goals and ways of operating. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't get you on the subject of Tony Fauci, because I'm sure you've been asked a lot about that in the last couple of years, and I think people are fascinated. And one thing you talk about in the book is the fights you had with Fauci in the 80s and 90s, particularly in trying to mold his approach to AIDS research. So talk a little about Fauci then, and then we'll get to Fauci now.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship started, caught us by surprise initially, because we targeted the FDA first, not, and Tony Fauci worked as director, his current job, which he's been in forever, director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, which is at the NIH. It's very separate from the FDA.
One does wonder how one could maintain a government job like that for so long.
I know. So our first target was FDA, and we discovered in like January of '89, right at a few months after our huge demo at the FDA, that Tony Fauci was also speaking out against overregulation by the FDA in regard to HIV/AIDS, and thought things should be sped up. And he tipped off an ACT UP member on it. We had one of the first issues was over ganciclovir, which prevented blindness in people with HIV, and we were after Ellen Cooper at the FDA, and he tipped this off that there was this new committee that was reviewing FDA regulations called the Lasagna Committee, named after its chair. And he said, why don't you go target them? So they went, ACT UP targeted that. And that footage is in How to Survive a Plague, us targeting Ellen Cooper. But after that demo, a bunch of ACT UPers took the subway, went over to NIH and demanded a meeting with Fauci. They didn't know he had been talking to other members. And he brought 3 of them up, and they said, we need the FDA to back off this call for an extra trial. And he said, I'm with you. And they asked him to call the head of the FDA, Frank Young, and plead our case. And he promised that he would do it. And then 3 days later, there's this huge article in the New York Times where the FDA is saying they're actually going to go back to the burner and review how much extra data they need on this. They're going to look at it again. And Fauci looks like the hero in the article. But he does mention that ACT UP pushed him to do this. He does mention the confrontation that happened 4 days earlier. So he gives us our due, but there's this synergy right away where he's also wants to bash the FDA, and we're bashing the FDA. So he helps us out. We win this DHP, this ganciclovir victory, and then we take to him our huge proposal for the FDA, which is parallel track, which would gain access to all these drugs while they're being developed. And he was for it. And he worked with us for the next few months to get all the details. Same thing happens again. Front page, New York Times, center column. He's the hero. He convinces the FDA to start parallel track. And then later inside, you see all these quotes from Mark Harrington saying, outlining ACT UP's involvement. And we're like, okay, now we see the game here.
Look,
he's using us, we're using him. But
at least it was up front. I have to say that one of the most surreal moments of the last 2 years in COVID was one day when I saw Trump standing at the podium in the White House briefing room talking about how they should do parallel track for some anti-COVID drug. And I thought, oh my God, surrealism in everyday life.
But then we turned on him. Because we turned our focus to NIH. And that's when the relationship got tough. And that's where his very traditional, methodical approach, which was the dominating, it was the way the scientific establishment worked. He was of that mind as well. And we were pushing him to be inventive and to figure out ways to go faster. And he kept his door open and listened, but it was like pulling teeth for a while to get him to move. And that's why we ended up with a gigantic demonstration at the NIH.
Led by you with those great colored smoke bombs. I love those. Now, without getting into the weeds, because we have limited time, but let's flash forward to the last couple of years and your observation of how he did operate and is operating on COVID.
Yeah, I mean, he was under fire. He was in the Trump White House right away, pulled into those crazy task force press conferences that started happening on a daily basis, and instantly drawn into this media-created duel with Trump. where he was correcting Trump on the science. And that became fascinating for the media. Trump eventually turned against him, but not before Tony and Deborah Birx still had full access and were able to convince Trump in March, two key Oval Office meetings in March, late March and early April, to shut down the country after what was happening in New York, and to maintain that shutdown for a little longer until we began to bring the first COVID burst, bring that curve down. And all the epidemiologists said if we hadn't done that, then by June or July, we would have had close to 1 million deaths nationwide, or around 800,000. Instead, we had about 150,000 by June or July. So those meetings saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Trump, I knew, and I was telling Tony, he's going to turn on you. He's getting all this shit from the conspiracy right. This isn't going to last. And sure enough, he did. By mid-April, he was turning against Fauci and Birx, and eventually sidelined them, and we know the rest of the history. And I was pushing by that summer for him to not resign from NIH, but resign from the task force. And he did not. He didn't. We had a back and forth on that, and it's all in this great book that the Washington Post put out on the crisis that you should all try to read as well.
And a lot of it is in Never Silent by Peter Staley, which if you look in the chat, you can find the link for how to buy it. And if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. And we do have a question that I want to read to you and also add to. George Beshan is asking, do you see similarities between AIDS denialists? And he mentioned screenwriter Melissa Wallach, but basically, the HIV is not the cause people, and COVID-idiots, the people who deny the existence of COVID, and can they be marginalized by the same means? And well, talk about that for a minute, and then I have a corollary question on that.
Well, so obviously they are. They are from the same idiot pool, and they are from they are conspiracy theories. But we had a lot easier time. AIDS denialism became one of the deadliest conspiracy theories in history in the early aughts because the President Mbeki of South Africa found their websites and decided to keep antivirals out of his country for 4 years before the Supreme Court forced his hand and let them in. And by that time, close to 400,000 South Africans died, and many tens of thousands of babies were infected, all needlessly, because one leader latched onto a conspiracy theory. Now, those 400,000 have since been absolutely overwhelmed by COVID conspiracy theories and the fact that Trump bought into them, and Bolsonaro in Brazil bought into them, and we're racking up 700,000 deaths here and 600,000 deaths in Brazil because of that. We were able to nip it in the bud with AIDS denialism, mostly because it didn't have a gigantic political apparatus behind it. It got snuffed out in South Africa by the activists there, using legal means to force ARVs. And then that country saw the huge difference that occurred when the crazy leader was keeping antiretrovirus out, and the years immediately after that. And so AIDS denialism was chased out of Africa by that victory. And it never really got a huge hold in the US. It certainly killed plenty of people here. But the one advantage we had here is most of the leaders of AIDS denialism were HIV positive themselves, and they kept dying because they refused to take ARVs.
Well, there's
So,
some of that with COVID too.
yeah.
I'm
But
conscious
there's a
of
gigantic network of vaccinated TV hosts
yes, yes,
who
exactly.
are selling this
Yeah.
for ratings. We
I'm,
didn't have that with AIDS denial.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'm rushing. And I want to do some questions that have come up in the chat as a sort of lightning round. So
There are two more in the Q&A as well.
Okay, great. So give me your quickest answers to these. In a world without the internet, how did you do your scientific research?
We had like a journal club. We got the journals from people that worked at universities. Doctors had subscriptions to these high-priced journals. We got all the copies. We started attending all the AIDS conferences, and there were community-run newsletters that were run by brilliant people like John James in San Francisco that would compile all this stuff. They would go to all the conferences, they would read all the journals, and we'd actually start talking to the head AIDS researchers. And all of that got compiled together. But it was definitely slower without the internet, but you could do it.
And it was fascinating. You know, I don't have a scientific background, but I loved reading the scientific material. It was all really fascinating. All right, on another subject, can you talk about the role of sexual connection between activists in the success of ACT UP and some of the drawbacks?
Drawbacks, there were none. The sexual connections among
us.
Why
wasn't there jealousy and anger at breakups or anything?
Oh God, yes. I mean, we were like high school, and we had cliques, and there was plenty of that. But thank God we were having lots of sex. You know, I talk about this in the memoir at length.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
We were the most pro-sex movement in American history. And it was a radical thing to do because AIDS stigma, when we came out in '87, AIDS stigma was at its peak in the country. And it was centered around this disgust of gay men about how we got AIDS, which, they were beginning to learn was primarily through anal sex. And that disgusted most of America. And so they thought we should be quarantined or put away. They definitely thought as soon as you got a diagnosis, that obviously means you stop having sex. And if you do have sex, you should be thrown in jail forever. ACT UP, instead of, treading lightly around that issue, which could have been one political tactic, we said, fuck that shit. We said, before that, the science had already proven that condoms blocked HIV. So we had proof, and if you knew how to use them, it was close to 100% effective. So we said there is such a thing as safer sex, and use condoms, and we emphasize both words, not just safer, but sex. We're going to have lots and lots and lots of safer sex, and we had kiss-ins at major straight bars like McHale's in the East Village, that Irish bar. We'd walk in and en masse, sit at tables and get our beers, and then 30 minutes into it, we'd all start deep throating each other and switching partners as we came up for air and just shocking the patrons. But there were too many of us to confront us physically. So, and everyone slept with everyone in ACT UP. I mean, God.
Not me.
Well, even some of the gay guys were sleeping with lesbians, which was,
I know.
I know.
And the lesbians were sleeping with each other.
Oh, they had their own sorority that was very active. And it was, it kept us. You see it in the movie Beats Per Minute (BPM), the French film about ACT UP Paris. It's not a documentary; it's a dramatization, and it perfectly captures how the only way we could get through this period of death and dying with all these memorials and hospital visits and losing people right and left, and losing your partner and losing your friend, was to burn both candles, burn the candle at both ends, and live to the fullest at the same time. To not stop living while you're doing this. In fact, turn up the volume when you're living. And we did that. We partied. We danced every weekend at the major clubs. We owned the downtown clubs during those years, and it was the most glorious years for New York's downtown scene. And we fucked like bunnies, and switched partners and had orgies, and it's the only thing that kept us from curling up into little balls and collapsing in mental exhaustion. So it was this surreal world of dealing with this intense, horrible stuff that led to PTSD, while also the most glorious living you've ever done.
And of course, all this was pre-protease inhibitors, because it was that desperate time and exciting and all of it. Protease inhibitors, of course, saved millions of lives and changed a great deal of it. But this is still happening. People are still getting infected. The issues are still there. You're involved with PrEP for All and a lawsuit against Gilead for charging too much for preventive medicine. So give us a little assessment of where things are now.
With Staley versus Gilead?
Well, with the epidemic and
yeah, well, you know, we're in an age of very different AIDS activism, and I love it today. It's I call it frustrated optimism. We actually have the tools to, when applied, can almost snuff out an epidemic within a community, the HIV epidemic, by getting people tested, getting them on therapy, getting them undetectable. They can no longer spread the virus when they're undetectable. Getting those who are at risk on the prevention drugs like PrEP. You do all these things and you snuff out the epidemic and you keep people with HIV alive. And they can almost live normal lives lengthwise. And the frustration comes in that politicians don't, spend a few dollars now to save a lot of lives and huge bucks down the road of ending the crisis now within their communities. And in red areas of this country where the Republicans control things, it's hard to use those tools. And in blue areas, we've been using them really well. New York has seen, double-digit decreases every year for the last 5 years. And San Francisco is close to getting to snuff out range. Got less than 100 infections a year now in San Francisco. That's just stunning. That's a stunning success. And we need to pat ourselves in the back as AIDS activists for doing things like that. There are countries in Africa that have done this. Botswana has done this. They have a better success rate of getting their population, which, by the way, is 23% of the entire population is HIV, adult population is HIV positive. But they've got 95% of them on treatment. That's better than most of the US. So when the politics align, we can really make a difference. And it's amazing to save lives in real time. When you and I were activists in ACT UP, we didn't know whether we'd save any lives. We didn't know whether it would ultimately pay off. A lot of us, the HIV positive members, didn't know if we'd live to see any victories. And a lot of us didn't live to see major victories. So very different periods of activism. But I'm in this till the end. I'm in this till we see a cure and a workable and some workable vaccines. Um, and
It
and
seems to me
I'm
there,
optimistic that I'll see that before
yeah,
before I'm gone.
I've been very skeptical about vaccines for decades, but suddenly in the last year or two, there are things coming along that look like they might actually be possible vaccines. Are you feeling the same way?
Well, this has actually been a hard year. I mean, there's some early promise, but we've had that for a couple decades on the vaccine front. But we had the big trials that have been happening. A couple of them flared out this year, and we had a lot of hope on those. But now they're looking at using the same technologies they did with COVID, the mRNA. They're looking at doing mRNA vaccines for HIV. There's a little bit too much hype around that. And if I can get quickly sciencey on this, I know a lot of people are like, why don't we have an HIV vaccine if we could get a COVID one in less than a year? And the main difference is because the viruses are very different. It is not because of a lack of effort on HIV vaccine research, which is what a lot of the population, including a lot of people with HIV, have come to believe. COVID is a relatively simple virus that targets cells in the lungs. HIV is the savviest virus that mankind has ever encountered, and it targets the immune system. It undermines, its goal is to destroy your immune system, which is what vaccines rely on. A vaccine doesn't do anything on its own. It teaches your immune system how to deal with the virus. But if the virus is getting around its whole purpose in life is to evade your immune system and destroy it, that's the problem. That's why vaccines haven't worked against HIV, because its sole job is to evade your immune system and destroy it. How do you develop a vaccine for that? And we're slowly trying to figure that out, but that's the problem. It's not for a lack of effort, folks.
So you refer to people who have been living with HIV for decades and feeling isolated, feeling discouraged, many of them sort of hung over from activism or just from all these years. What's your assessment of life for them, and what's your message to them?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, they've studied, there was a study of ACT UP survivors, including negative, positive, all of us, all the alumni. And fortunately, it was a mixed picture. I mean, there were definitely a bunch that were who were suffering and were dealing with isolation, with loneliness. They had lost most of their peers to AIDS, so there were less avenues to be social, a much smaller circle of friends, much smaller circle of potential partners. Um, and our bodies, if you're positive, our bodies are beaten up. Our healthcare is a lot harder to manage. We are, in essence, aged by HIV about 10 years older than we actually are, even with effective antiretrovirals. But there are many, we went through the ringer, and a lot of us learned coping skills through that as well. So there were quite a few that were doing quite well and thriving still. So it was a mixed bag. And we had a big push after Spencer Cox's death, rallying AIDS organizations from around the country to really look at this issue and start putting back together programs for these long-term survivors to make sure that they are not, being left to themselves. I encourage folks that are feeling that way to to reach out and try to find whatever groups do exist. And if they don't, try to get them going. I mean, I spend most of my time in very, very rural Pennsylvania, near Milford, PA. And we started, it's just, there's nothing around here. We started an HIV support group in Milford. And it's only got 5 regular members. But I do it once a month. I'm back in an HIV support group. And we've got everything from a young millennial girl, a young woman, who's now 24, 25 years old, dear friend of mine, Brenda Goodrow, who was born with HIV. So totally unique set of issues, all the way to us old timers in the group who have been through the ringer. So, and we're there for each other. I think, but we had to self-start it. We had to, get things going. So you're going to have to take a little initiative, but there are groups to join and places to reach out. We got GMHC back at it, and I think San Francisco does a fairly good job. And speak out if your AIDS service organization, the closest one to you, isn't serving you.
Well, thank you, Peter. I think that's great advice. I suspect we are towards the end of our time. Ben,
Yeah, we're over.
you may jump in. I just want to say that all of this and much, much more is in Peter's book, everything from lots of other fun actions like the condom over Helm's house and breaking into the stock exchange and our Stop the Church action and your struggle with crystal meth and and how to survive a plague. We didn't get to that, but Never Silent is the book by Peter Staley. Thank you for doing this, Peter, and
Thanks,
for
Ann.
sharing all of this with us.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Anne. Thanks everyone for joining. It was a fantastic, colorful reading and conversation. I feel like we really covered a lot of ground and I appreciate it. Like I said, you can buy the book on greenlightbookstore.com. We'll ship it anywhere in the US, anywhere you are tuning in from. And we really appreciate you joining us. Thanks everyone again. Thank you, Peter and Anne. And thanks for your thank yous too.
Yes.
And I hope everyone has a good night.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.